Hey guys, Steve Caruso here. The Lord's Prayer is, with very little debate, one of the most significant pieces of liturgy in the Christian tradition. It is a prayer that transcends denominational boundaries, acting as a common language and supplication for most of the faith. We often study it in the Greek texts of Matthew and Luke, and they are magnificent. And they are our primary window into the early church, but we know that the language of first century Galilee wasn't Greek, but Aramaic. And as one would expect, the very words used in the Gospels often point back to an underlying Aramaic tradition, whether it's in the words that we find transcribed in the text or underlying the very Greek narrative itself. So, for those of us who are interested in the historical and linguistic roots of the New Testament, there is a question that always lingers around the Lord's Prayer. What did it actually sound like in the language of its origin? So, today I don't want to talk about hidden meanings or modern mysticism or anything like that. I want to talk about historical reality. I want to look at the linguistic footprints left behind and attempt a careful reconstruction of the prayer as it might have been spoken in the streets and homes of Galilee. And I want to do this in three parts. The first part that you're watching right now is going to go over some questions about certain portions of the prayer from an Aramaic lens, and some questions that are of note if we're going to do a proper translation. The second part is going to talk about misinformation about the Lord's Prayer that is currently circulating all over the internet, and why this is making it hard to find reliable information to that end. And in the third part, we're going to go over a full reconstruction, line by line, and try our best to pronounce it based upon how we know how Galileans in the first century physically spoke. There are still some things we don't know, but I'd wager it's going to be close. So first, let's think about some questions about the text that tend to puzzle contemporary translators. Let us begin where the prayer begins, with the address, Abba, Father. In the most primitive forms of the prayer, like what we see in Luke, God is addressed simply as Father. In Galilean Aramaic, this would be Abba, found in the emphatic or definite form. This form functions as both a direct address, what we call that a vocative in linguistics, and in some contexts an indication of personal possession. It's much like in English how one would ask a family member, like, how is father doing? Kind of implying my father or our father. And there's a common misconception that Abba means, well, that it's a diminutive. That it's cutesy or that it's childish, sort of like a way of addressing God in an unfamiliar form, child babble, akin to daddy, which was first posited by James Barr some years ago. And this isn't helped by the fact that it was adopted from Aramaic into modern Hebrew for that purpose and is used as such today. But linguistic evidence tells us a different story. In the New Testament, we see Abba transliterated directly into Greek letters, alpha, beta, beta, alpha. And in every single instance, it is immediately followed by a literal Greek translation. O pater, the Father. In Mark, during the agony in Gethsemane, it is the cry of a soul in distress. In Romans, it is the cry of the adopted child. In Galatians, it is the cry of the believer. It is a word used by children and adults alike. It is a word of relationship, not just of affection, and this was a unique contrast to contemporary Jewish practice. There we see folk claiming their Abba as Abraham or Avraham, and as we see in John 9 in the True Children of Abraham debate, with their Abba as Avraham, they wanted to avad as Avraham would avad, or do as Abraham would do. So God as Abba is a distinct feature of the Christian tradition. We're going to want to keep that. Next, one of the most fascinating challenges that this reconstruction has to face involves a single Greek word, epeusion. This word is used to describe the daily part of our daily bread. And it's a linguistic anomaly. It appears nowhere else in the entire corpus of Greek literature before it shows up here, in the prayers of Matthew and Luke. We refer to such unique words as hapax legomena, or legomenon in the singular. When you come across a hapax in a corpus of text, you've got a problem. Here it suggests that the Greek translators were struggling to capture a specific Aramaic concept. Like any multilingual native speaker straddling two cultures, they had to coin or at least adapt a word to express a meaning that the Greek language couldn't quite wrap itself around. And what's worse is that when we look to other early authors for clues who wrote in other languages like Latin, such as Augustine or Cyril of Jerusalem, they translated it as superstantialem, another hapax. So that doesn't help us at all. Although in Latin, the constituent parts of the Greek are a lot more clear. In English, you'll sometimes see the word supersubstantial, which means above what is needed for sustenance. But linguists know that a word is not merely the sum of its parts. A word's meaning is derived from how it is used. Otherwise, you get things like a carnival, with rides and games becoming a meat circus or a grisly abattoir, because the word comes from the Latin caro, flesh, and levare, or to raise or remove, literally meaning removing flesh, which makes more sense in context, as it did, as the name of the final hurrah before Lent, during which eating of meat was forbidden. But that's not how we use it today in English. So, with epeusion or supersubstantial, what word were they trying to translate? I've looked at many different possibilities, and the most likely candidate that I have found is the word tsorach. It is a very well-attested word in the Galilean corpus, and it comes from a root meaning to be poor, to need, to be necessary. It is a word of thresholds, which is where it gets a little bit abstract. And because of that, it might be precisely where the Greek failed. It refers to that which is required, or all that is necessary, in many cases for survival. In religious debates among the rabbis, it was also used in the sense of what is necessary, from the perspective of the law of Moses, or which rabbi's opinions were valid. And finally, it can be used in the sense of should, and even baser needs like, I need to go to the bathroom. So, this word is abstract, and it doesn't quite map one-to-one onto any particular Greek concept in its depth of meaning, although, ironically in English, just our word for need or needed, at least in this context, works pretty well. So, we'll want to keep that. Furthermore, we see a possible cultural specificity in how to render the word for bread itself. While much of the Aramaic-speaking world might use the very, very common lacham for bread, in Galilee, the more common word was actually pitha, a word cognate to pita bread that we recognize today, although it was used in the generic sense for all different kinds of bread, much like how you would use the word Kleenex for all types of tissue. And where it would be perfectly fine to say lacham, a Galilean would more likely have used the more colloquial pitha instead. Bread in contemporary culture had a profound philosophical weight. In some Aramaic traditions, bread is described as literally the doorpost of the heart, which we would probably better understand figuratively as the support of the mind, or your cognizance. When we pray for our needed bread, we're not just asking for calories. We as humans are asking for the very sustenance that supports our minds, bodies, and spirits. So we'll have to keep that in mind too. Finally, we come to the petition for forgiveness. And this is where the linguistic layers of Aramaic provide a little more interesting depth that is often lost in translation. So bear with me. In the dialects of Jesus' time, the word for sin was often synonymous with the word for debt, or chov. To be a sinner was quite literally to be a debtor. When you sinned, to pay restitution for that sin, you'd go to the temple and offer a sacrifice, and then your debt of sin was essentially repaid. And when we look at the verbs for forgive, shvak, or to permit or forsake, and shere, to loosen or unpack, there's some familiar wordplay that we see elsewhere in the Gospels. The word for debtor, or αββα, is so very close to the word for love, ħibba. They play upon similar but very, very different lexical roots, and this similarity was well known. In the parable of the two debtors, for example, Jesus uses this very linguistic tension. A certain lender had two chaybin, or debtors. The one owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they couldn't pay, he, shvak, forgave them both. Which of them therefore will yechabev, love him the most? This very wordplay is arguably in the Lord's Prayer. He demonstrates that the release of debt and the act of love are inextricably linked. When we pray, as we forgive our debtors, the Aramaic ear might hear an echo of, as we forgive our loved ones. Christ did teach, do unto others as you would have done to you. These are all additional notes on the same theme. So with these things in mind, a reconstruction of the prayer is now a work in progress, an effort to strip away the layers of later centuries and find the foundational heartbeat of the text. Remember, this is not about finding secret meanings or hidden knowledge. In fact, I would argue it's quite the opposite. What we're going to see later is there is a fidelity of transmission of the Lord's Prayer, even despite nuance that may or may not have been properly understood. The forest is intact, despite maybe a couple of trees being in different places. Our task here is about honoring the linguistic reality of the people who first uttered these words together. So where do we begin from here? In our next session, we will move on to much more difficult territory. There are lots, and I mean lots, of so-called Aramaic Lord's Prayers that circulate all on the internet these days, and most of them are problematic. So we will examine them next and understand what not to do with our reconstruction efforts and why. And then after that, we'll see about bringing all of these words in one place together and piece together how someone in the first century in Galilee may have put one in front of the other. So until next time, Shalom Lachom. There's no sponsor for this video, but if you want to help support the project, you can always go over to my Ko-fi page and chip in. I'm also working on a number of physical workbooks for this series, and if you're interested in those, I'll have a link to them around here somewhere. In any case, see you next time.